Hi, I'm Sensei Rob, and in the next few minutes, you're going to learn Sensei Rob's 5 rules of presentational speaking. I've always believed that presentational speaking is a lot like the martial arts, with the proper amount of the 3 Ds: dedication, determination, and discipline. Anyone can become a master. Sensei Rob's 5 rules of presentational speaking will provide you with an excellent foundation on which to build your future presentational speaking exploits. So, without further delay, Sensei Rob's 5 rules of presentational speaking. Sensei Rob's rule number 1 is speech stance. Speech stance is a comfortable and relaxed position from which to deliver your presentational speech. You should start with your feet about shoulder width apart. You might angle your toes out slightly, but you definitely don't want to angle them in like this. This looks like a duck. This is not Sensei Rob's speech stance. So your feet should be shoulder width apart, your back should be straight, your head should be pointed forward, your shoulders should be in a comfortable and relaxed position, and your hands should stay at your sides. This is Sensei Rob's rule number 1, speech stance. Now, many people, particularly the ladies, are going to struggle with what I call the hip pop. The hip pop occurs when, rather than following Sensei Rob's rule number 1, speech stance, and having your weight centered over both feet, you lapse and put all your weight onto one leg, popping your hip at the joint. This is the hip pop. This is not good speech stance. And as this foot dangles around off to the side, it makes you look like you're not confident in what you're saying and you're not comfortable as a presenter, which reduces your credibility. So, Sensei Rob's rule number 1, speech stance, means you should have your feet about shoulder width apart, your back should be straight, your head should be up, your shoulders should be relaxed, and your hands should be at a comfortable and relaxed position at your sides. So, to review, Sensei Rob's rule number 1 is? I can't hear you. Sensei Rob's rule number 1 is?
Speech stance.
Which leads us to Sensei Rob's rule number 2, stay put. Sensei Rob's rule number 2, stay put, means unless you have a good reason to move, don't move. Stay put. Now, when I was an undergraduate, I had an instructor who was so famous for walking back and forth in front of the classroom as he delivered his lectures that he became the butt of all the jokes in the school. In fact, everyone who took his class would treat it as a contest, trying to figure out who could count the most number of trips back and forth in front of the room in a given class period. And I kid you not, in one single 50-minute class period on a Wednesday, that professor walked back and forth in front of the class no fewer than 293 times. Now, certainly, none of us were listening to a word that he had to say. We were simply watching the pacing back and forth in front of the class. It's distracting to the audience when you move without purpose. So Sensei Rob's rule number 2, stay put, means unless you have a good reason to move, don't move. Stay put. Now, some of you are probably thinking, if I have to stand in one spot for an entire presentation, I think my head will explode. Well, it probably won't. But just in case, it doesn't mean that you can't move. It just means that your movement should be purposeful. One way to have purposeful movement in your presentation employs the use of the 3-point walk. Here's how it works. As you enter your speaking space, you'll center yourself in front of the audience. Sometimes you may have occasion to speak in a room where the audience is all clustered on one side or the other. And in those situations, you should never center yourself in the room, but rather you should center yourself to the audience. After all, they are the reason for your presentation. So center yourself to the audience. Find a good speech stance and begin delivering your presentation. As you transition from your introduction into your first main point, you might take a few steps over to the right side of the audience and devote more eye contact and attention to the people on that side as you deliver your first main point. Then, as you deliver your transition from main point 1 to main point 2, you might walk over to the other side and spend a little more time focusing your eye contact and attention to the individuals on that side of the room. As you transition to your third main point, step back to the center of the audience, and as you move into your conclusion, you might even take a step forward if you like. The three-point walk is a really nice way to add purposeful movement to your presentations because it provides a physical component to your oral transitions and will help your audience actually follow the organization of your speech more easily. Now, some advice when you use the three-point walk. First, you must rehearse it. If you fail to rehearse the three-point walk, it's going to look something like this. Now I'm transitioning from my introduction into my first main point. Or something like this. Now that I've told you about main point 1, I'd like to tell you about main point 2. In either case, that is bad news. Your transition should be delivered orally at the same time you're making the physical transition with the three-point walk. So, Sensei Rob's rule number 1 is?
Speech stance.
Rule number 2?
Stay put.
Which leads us to Sensei Rob's rule number 3, sway not. Now, many people, as they begin giving presentational speeches, will find that they're a little bit nervous. And that nervous energy, if they are staying put, will sometimes result in them failing to follow Sensei Rob's rule number 1, speech stance. Maybe they'll lapse into the hip pop like this. But after a while, all that weight on one foot starts to get uncomfortable. So you might shift over to this foot, and then back, and then back, and then back, until eventually it looks like you are a weeble who drank a case of Red Bull. You know, weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. This is not great. It reduces your credibility because it makes you look like you aren't confident in what you are saying. It's distracting to the audience, and it reduces their ability to pay attention to the important information that you're trying to communicate. Now, many people, when they realize that this is something that they do, think, how can I possibly be aware of my swaying back and forth as I'm rehearsing my presentation? Well, there are 2 things that you can try to help you follow Sensei Rob's rule number 3, sway not. The first involves the use of an empty can of pop. Take the can, place it between your knees, adopt a comfortable speech stance, and then begin rehearsing your presentation. What you'll find is, if you fail to follow Sensei Rob's rule number 3, sway not, and lapse into a hip pop, or otherwise begin to sway, the pop can will fall from your knees, and you'll be reminded that you need to follow Sensei Rob's rule number 3, sway not. The other thing you can do is take a couple of chairs. Find a good spot to practice your presentation. Pull the chairs right up to your hips, just like this. Adopt a comfortable speech stance, and again, begin rehearsing your presentation. What you'll find is, if you start to sway back and forth or lapse into the hip hop, at the end of your practice session, you'll be able to look down and see how well you did or didn't do. So, to review, Sensei Rob's rule number 1 is?
Speech stance.
Rule number 2?
Stay put.
Rule number 3?
Sway not.
Which leads us to Sensei Rob's rule number 4, still hands. Now, Sensei Rob's rule number 4, still hands, does not mean still hands, the choir boy. It does not mean still hands, the fig leaf. It does not mean still hands, the tin soldier. And it does not mean still hands, the firing squad. Sensei Rob's rule number 4, still hands, means unless you are gesturing in a way that adds meaning or connects with your audience, don't move your hands. Keep them at a comfortable and relaxed position at your sides. So if you are not actively gesturing, keep your hands still. Your fingers should curl in a comfortable and relaxed position at your sides. You don't want to be having your hands like blades at your sides like this, because that's more like domo arigato, Mr. Roboto. Not great. Just allow your hands to fall And wherever they lay, that is your comfortable and relaxed position to deliver your presentation from. As you like, you may start to integrate gestures into your presentation, and to the extent that they support what you're saying or engage the audience, you're doing a good job of following Sensei Rob's rule number 4, still hands. So Sensei Rob's rule number 4, it doesn't mean no hand movement. It simply means if your movements are not purposeful, keep them at your side, still hands. So, to review, Sensei Rob's rule number 1 is?
Speech stance.
Rule number 2?
Stay put.
Rule number 3?
Sway not.
Rule number 4?
Still hands.
Which leads us to Sensei Rob's rule number 5, solid gestures. Now, Sensei Rob's rule number 5, solid gestures, means that the gestures you use should have the characteristics of good presentational speaking gestures. The first characteristic of good gestures is that they are above the waist. Many people, when they start to give presentations, will not quite be sure what to do with their hands. And so, rather than making good, solid gestures, they'll keep their hands below their waists and maybe just gesture a little bit here or a little bit there to emphasize certain points, but never really get the hands above the waist. What do these look like? They look like penguin flippers. And your gestures should never look like penguin flippers unless you're actually talking about penguins. So the first part of Sensei Rob's rule number 5, solid gestures, is that your gestures should be above your waist. If you turn your elbows in a 90-degree angle, that's about the lowest plane where good presentational speaking gestures should occupy. If you move them up above, that's good. Down here, penguin flippers. We don't want to see penguin flippers unless you're talking about penguins. Now, the second characteristic of solid gestures is that your gestures should be purposeful. Now, I once had a student who was really good in terms of keeping his gestures above that elbow level, the rule of elbow, right? And so he was really good at not doing the penguin flippers down here, but at keeping his gestures above the waist, above the elbow, and engaging the audience with his gestures. The problem with his gestures is that every single gesture looked like a karate chop, which is great if you're a martial artist and are breaking bricks. But it's not great if you're using the same gesture to emphasize every single word that you're saying. It's not purposeful. Ultimately, it becomes distracting to your audience, and it fails to add anything useful to your presentation. So not only should your gestures be above the waist, but they should also be purposeful. Good gestures can do a lot of things in your presentation. They can expand on what you're saying. They can reinforce your message. They might even contrast with what you're saying. And gestures are good when they do all of these things. So make sure, as you rehearse your presentations, that your gestures are solid. So, to review, last time, Sensei Rob's rule number 1 is?
Speech stance.
Rule number 2?
Stay put.
Rule number 3?
Sway not.
Rule number 4?
Still hands.
And rule number 5?
Solid gestures.
This might seem like a lot to remember at first, but with the proper amount of the 3 Ds, dedication, determination, and discipline, and the 1 R, rehearsal, you too can learn and follow Sensei Rob's 5 rules of presentational speaking. And the audiences will be amazed at your poise and presentational skill.